Hi, Misha here, and I have a video that might seem at first a little dull, but bear with me. I think this will be more interesting than you think. This is on trainer aircraft of the British Royal Air Force, RAF, and British Royal Navy, RN, from really the 1930s to today. And have a mix of 4 jets and 4 propeller driven, and from several different model makers. Over here we have the de Havilland Tiger Moth, kind of one of the first purpose-built trainers that the RAF used. This was the development of the original Moth, the DH-60. This is the DH-82 in de Havilland parlance. Its development really began as a monoplane, but then turned back into a biplane. 1931, the prototype first flew, and the RAF ordered a prototype. It liked how it performed, so late that year it ordered 35 standard planes with a wheeled undercarriage and 2 float planes like this, and they were put into initial use in 1932. In 1934, the plane was upgraded to what people refer to as the Tiger Moth 2, essentially a more powerful engine and other refinements to make it better at its job. It was a 2-seat trainer, about 24 feet by 27 feet long. It was about as fast as a modern-day car. Cruise speed about 65-70 miles per hour, with a max speed of about 110 miles per hour. Could get up to about 13,000 feet, although I'd imagine being an open cockpit, it got a little chilly. Pretty typical biplane. It was essentially easy to fly acceptably, but difficult to fly well, especially during acrobatics, which made it a great trainer. 1934, 35, 36, de Havilland in the UK received a lot of orders. Military, RAF took priority. There were a lot of interested civilian customers, but, again, the military took priority. Luckily, in 1937, de Havilland Canada started manufacturing the Tiger Moth, and de Havilland UK kind of caught up with demand. So more and more civilian Tiger Moths appeared. And by 1939, when World War II kicked off, they had built around 1,500, 500 or so in the RAF. Although once war began, many civilian or privately owned Tigers were conscripted and used very heavily. At the beginning of the war, 39, 40, these were used quite a bit as a maritime patrol and scout craft, basically to spot U-boats and the like off the coast. In fact, several squadrons were equipped as such. So no longer strictly speaking a trainer. And in fact, as an emergency measure, around 350 were fitted with bomb racks to carry either 20 or 25 pound bombs, iron bombs, and these were used for patrol, but never actually used in combat, which is probably a good thing. These continued to be the basic primary trainer of the RAF and Royal Navy throughout World War II, with production ending in 1944 in both UK and Canada, at which time they had built a little under 9,000 total. Of course, this was also exported to several nations, just being a solid, dependable, conventional biplane. And it, stayed in RAF service, although it was getting replaced by newer models after the war. But it was still in primary use through the 40s and early 50s. Started to be phased out in favor of a new de Havilland design. And the last ones were removed from the RAF in 1959. But there are still some Tiger Moths flying today. Restored ones. And like I said, they did use these as float planes. And that's why I picked up this model. I thought it was just different to have a float. It is from Oxford. It's kind of their more fancy line. And it may be my favorite from Oxford because it's very weighty. Typically the ones from them, if you watch my Anson and Airspeed Oxford video, they're a little light. They're metal, but kind of lightweight. This is pretty solid. The floats are made of metal. At least the bottom wing is metal. And the top is too. So it's got a lot of metal in it. It's got the rigging. If you get, for example, the Aviation 72 Tiger Moth, the rigging's not pre-installed. You have to do it. Well, this one already comes rigged up. And the propeller spins. Comes with a pretty good stand. The only downside, there's no crew figures in it, but that's okay. Obviously, not landing gear up or down because it has floats, but of course they make a standard wheeled version as well. Just a classic de Havilland and a classic British plane. Well, we'll move on to the next de Havilland. Next up from de Havilland, we have the Chipmunk, or the Chippy, as it's nicknamed. The British have a habit of nicknaming pretty much all their stuff. And this actually is a development from de Havilland, Canada. In fact, it was their first post-war project and their first domestic design to go into full mass production. Work on this began in 1945, and the prototype flew in the spring of 46, and it was into production late that same year. Like the Tiger Moth, this was a purpose-built trainer. It is now, as you see, a monoplane with an enclosed cockpit for two. Has fixed landing gear. Still a two-blade propeller. About 25 and a half feet long. About 34 feet wingspan. Was faster. It could get up to about 140 miles per hour. And it liked to cruise at, 100, 110 miles per hour. Had a little higher ceiling too. Could get up nearly to 16,000 feet. I'm sure the enclosed cockpit made things a lot more comfortable as well. Early on, the Canadian military and the British were interested. And they both tried it out. Went into service in 1948. Canada would end up fielding about 130 of these, and Britain would end up fielding over 730. Total production was pretty respectable for post-war. Around 1,400, a little less actually. The first 200 or so were made in Canada by de Havilland, but over 1,000 were made in United Kingdom by de Havilland UK. So the majority, even though they were developed in Canada, were built in England. This would remain the standard basic trainer in Canada, replacing the Tiger Moth, and stay in active service until 72. So respectable. But in the UK, it really went the distance. It was not fully retired until 1996. So 50 years old at the time. It's a very aerobatic plane. You see it's got a very slender fuselage, very simple, elegant lines. It is very easy to fly, very maneuverable. Prince Philip was a fan, it said. It's also used by the Royal Navy and the Army as a trainer. Its only kind of semi-combat use happened in 1958 in Cyprus, where it was used as kind of a scout patrol plane. It was also used a bit in Europe as a scout patrol or transport of a sort, but mostly it was a trainer. This model is from Aviation 72. Very similar features to a Whitty. It does have moving propeller. The landing gear do rotate. They're fixed. Of course, they were fixed on the factory one too. Cockpit is there, but it is very heavy. It's all metal. Even the tail is metal, and the landing gear are mostly metal. So, neat little model. The Chippy. I don't have it on its stand because these can be a little unstable. This isn't too bad. On a wood surface or a regular surface, it's fine, but on a kind of cloth surface, they get a little unstable. So I thought, I'll just take it off to avoid any embarrassment and or broken model. Yeah. The Chipmunk. Well, for interest, let's progress from prop planes for a minute and talk about a rather famous British jet trainer. Okay, doing these a bit out of order, but hey, my video. Now we have the Folland Gnat. This is called the T.1. It was, by the way, the Chipmunk was called the T.10 in the RAF. The Gnat was an advanced trainer, really one of the first advanced jet trainers the RAF had. This didn't really start off as a trainer, though. As early as 1950 and through the early 50s, Folland was researching and trying to develop a light jet fighter or fighter bomber, because it was viewing that at that time planes were getting bigger and bigger, more expensive, more complicated, harder to maintain, and it wanted to go the other direction. So kind of the concept of the F-5 Tiger later on in America and several other places, and kind of going along ideas of the MiG-15 and later MiG-17. So not without precedent, but a good idea. This would really result in the Midge, which flew in 1954 for the first time. Then what would become the Gnat first flew in 1955, known as the F-1, the fighter version. The RAF would get a couple and try them out, but no, didn't really need them as it gone to other fighter projects. They would actually acquire a few more of the fighter setup Gnats for another trial in 58, but again it lost out. But, liking the plane, liking how easy it was to maintain, liking the overall cost or lack thereof, they were interested in a two-seat version as a dedicated trainer. So, Folland had already been working on that. Basically, the two-seat version lacked the 30mm cannon and had a slightly longer fuselage. Well, the RAF acquired a prototype in August of '59, tried it out, liked it, and ordered some. Primary deliveries would happen between 1960 and 65, but really ramping up in 62 through 65. One of the concerns that the RAF had about having a contract with Folland was it was a very small independent company, but luckily or not, Hawker Systems, Hawker Siddeley, bought them out in 1960, which really kind of allayed a lot of fears and concerns. So what do we have here? Well, it's a long plane, at least relatively, under about 29 feet, but a very narrow wingspan of about 22 feet. It's what I would call transonic, although technically subsonic. It could get up to about 700 miles per hour, although it could exceed Mach 1 in a dive, at least some versions. And it had a very respectable altitude of about 48,000 feet. So it was a little performer. And it was quite aerodynamic and acrobatic, to the point that in 1964, the Yellow Jacks display team selected it, and these became the Red Arrows in '65. So the Red Arrows, it's really their first plane they flew. The fighter version would receive some orders, primarily from Finland, Yugoslavia, and India, who would actually make a version under license, but we'll save that talk for another day. So the fighter did have some success, but not in Britain. This would continue as the advanced trainer until the Hawk started to appear in the late 70s. So by 79 it started to be phased out and retired. Basically, and we'll get into this plane in just a minute, this is the Jet Provost. This was their primary basic jet trainer. After that, pilots, if they were on the fast fighter track, in other words, they weren't going to be in bombers or anything, they would transition over to the Folland Gnat here, and then they would transition over to the Hawker Hunter T6 or T7 trainer, and then finally they would start training in the aircraft of their choice or assignment. So this was an intermediate step, but it was a pretty high performance little jet for what it was. And it was very low maintenance, relatively cheap, easy to keep running, maintain. At least in the RAF, Finland had some trouble with the fighter version, but again, story for another day. The model here is again from Aviation 72. Very similar features to the Woody. Has landing gear in the down position, which is kind of but it does appear to be made pretty much all of metal, including the tail. It does have the vortex generators on the wings, has the fuel tanks, it's got a cockpit, probe in the front. So well-appointed little plane for what it is, and really Aviation 72, typical stand, is about the only place to do the Gnat. Aside, I think JC Wings did some, but yeah, they've done several versions. And it's definitely an iconic, dart-shaped little British jet. Pretty cool, I think. In some ways, I think it's a cooler looking plane than the Hawk, even. But let's move on to what was technically its predecessor. Alright. So this was actually the RAF's first jet trainer, and this was considered a basic trainer, where people would start on jet work. This is the Jet Provost, or Provost. Originally, it started off as a design from Hunting Percival, and it started off as a propeller-driven prop plane. Developed in the late 40s and into the 51, it was the Percival Provost. But the company recognized that propellers were on the way out. They already had the Chipmunk and didn't really need another one. And so they started to rework it into a jet. And originally this was a internal company design, private venture. In 53, though, the British government became interested and started to fund the project, and that helped kick it off, which became the Jet Provost. We would have a prototype version in 1954 fly, and then the first pre-production version would be in 1955 it would fly. There would be trials from mid-55 through mid-56 in the RAF, as they'd ordered a few pre-production models, and they quickly discovered that, hey, students' performance is really increasing when they use an actual jet trainer. So 200 were ordered, and we'll go from there. Now, originally that would be the T1 version. They would go through the T2, T3, T4. Ultimately, this is the T5, the final version. Went into production in 1967. But, yeah, they just kept improving things. They also had things like an oxygen generator, better, this and that. You can look it up. Wikipedia is a great thing. But, yeah, overall dimensions were about 34 feet long, almost at a perfect box at 35 feet wingspan. Quite a bit slower than the Gnat. We're at 440 miles per hour, so still significantly faster than a propeller. Well, some propellers, a propeller trainer, let's say. But slow enough that a pilot can learn on it without making egregious. As you see, it's a side-by-side cockpit. Kind of unique. Had a maximum altitude of about 36,000 feet. And really started to enter into RAF service 1958, 1959. And deliveries would continue through the 1960s. Production would end around 68, with about 740 built. By the way, I forgot to mention on the Gnat, they would build about 450, not counting production in India. Anyway, sorry about that. So even though production ended in the 60s, this would remain a basic trainer in the RAF through the 70s, into the 80s, and the last ones weren't retired out until 1993. So it's kind of a pretty long-lived plane. It was built from the ground up as a trainer. However, there was an armed version known as the Strike Master, which I'll probably talk about in a different video because there is a model of it too. This did start off as a Percival design, but they got bought out by BAC, so it's known as the BAC, or BAC as my speech calls it, Jet Provost. This model is from Skymax, so a different brand than what we've been looking at, which was essentially Hobby Master, but for one thing, they're cheaper line, but also they're less known planes, kind of the more obscure planes. So it comes with gear up or down, canopy can be displayed open or closed. However, no pilot figures, but a 1/72 scale Hobby Master pilot will fit in. Just FYI. So nice little model, typical Hobby Master quality. A few corners cut, but not many. And it's predominantly metal, but a little less so than the previous planes we've looked at, just because it does have a little more detail, a little more options. Honestly, of the stands, this is not one of my favorite. Now, the plane plugs into the top of the stand, awesome. But the bottom is this weird triangle-ish shape, and it's not very well balanced. Now, on again, a solid surface, it's better, but on a soft surface like this, it's wobbly, so I am wary. But so far, so good, but it probably won't last. Luckily, there's not really much to break off this plane. It's pretty straightforward. That's probably my biggest gripe about the Skymax is the base. The top part's very Hobby Master, but the base is a little slimmer. I don't even like the Hobby Master stands that well. I actually think the Oxford and the Corgi stands are better, but we'll get to that. But yeah, their basic jet trainer. From here, they might move on to bombers or reconnaissance planes, or maybe even a desk. Who knows? But a neat plane and a neat part of British history that served for over 30 years. Well, we're halfway through, so let's move on to the next row. Oh, we're kind of halfway through. Hope this has been somewhat interesting. I don't know, I found it kind of fun. Everyone talks about the military aircraft, and as you know, I have a good bit of those, but I don't know, trainers are kind of interesting. For example, here, we have the Scottish Aviation Bulldog T.1, and as you see, this is again a propeller-driven aircraft, which was initially developed in the mid-late 1960s by a company known as Beagle. And they designated it as the B-125 Bulldog as an advanced trainer. Excuse me, as a basic, trainer or kind of generic just aircraft. Modern propeller-driven. And they actually had an order from the Swedish Air Force, placed after the prototype flew in 1969, but before they could actually go to full manufacturing of the plane, Beagle was bought out by Scottish Aviation, so that's where the name comes from. And Sweden did receive its order. The first 58 were delivered in 1971, with a follow-up order for 20 more planes a year later. So Sweden operated about 78 of these, give or take. So what do we have here? Well, this is a side-by-side two-seat aircraft for training. It can hold a third passenger. The cockpit is roomy enough. They did even test models to hold 4 people, although I don't think they went into production. It is relatively small. It's about 23 feet long with a wingspan of about 33 feet. It faster than our other propellers. It goes up to about 150 miles per hour and has an altitude of around 16,000 feet. Has fixed landing gear. It's a pretty simplistic little plane. Meant to be cheap and easy to operate, durable, reliable, so on and so forth. Well, after the Swedish Air Force, the RAF became interested in 1972 and tried it out, kind of as a replacement for the aging Chipmunk, and ordered 130, which were delivered in the next couple of years. So this started to replace the Chipmunk and a few other basic trainers in the 1970s and 1980s. And, Scottish Aviation would ultimately produce about 330 for all clients and customers. They would kind of play around with an armed reconnaissance or light attack version with hard points under the wings for gun pods or rocket packs. But the basic version for the RAF was never armed up. This would also be used by the Royal Navy as a basic trainer, and had a good, if not terribly remarkable, service. In 2001, both Sweden and the Royal Navy would retire their Bulldogs, and the Navy would actually sell theirs off on the surplus market. You think getting a surplus infield or whatever is expensive? Imagine buying a surplus airplane, although they were a good deal. But the Royal Air Force, while this plane has been partially retired today, still hangs on to a few for various duties. Because it could seat 3, it was also sometimes used as a light passenger transport as well. Just kind of neat to see a wholly new modern propeller design. This model is from Aviation 72, like the couple we've seen before. Again, it has moving propeller, the landing gear roll. It's pretty much all metal, which is pretty neat. Funny story, when I first saw that Aviation 72 made a Bulldog, I immediately thought of the early 1930s biplane fighter Bulldog, the one that served alongside the Hawker Fury. And then I realized later that it was the Scottish Aviation Bulldog. Rather different plane. I thought it would have been interesting if I had immediately bought one of these, and then when it came in, I would have been very confused. But yeah, again, Aviation 72 bringing us a pretty simple but sturdy model of an otherwise relatively obscure plane. But one I think is pretty neat and still in British service today. Well, with that said, let's move on to what is perhaps the most famous British trainer. Actually, one of two on the table. Next up, we have one of the most famous trainers in the world, and a plane that's appeared in a couple of previous videos already, but why not show her off again? You really can't do a British trainer video and not talk about the Hawker Hawk. This is the T1 or TMK1, T Mark 1. Essentially the original version. And this has a very similar story to the Folland Gnat, really, and replaced it. This was an advanced trainer, and still is to this day, 2019 at least, in the RAF, and has been a big export. It dates back all the way to 1964, when Hawker was looking into making a new light fighter, economical fighter for third world nations. Also, that could be a trainer, or if you like, a trainer that could be armed up. So it was kind of developed from the beginning as a dual purpose craft. This time we have Hawker Siddeley. Later, of course, Hawker would become part of British Aerospace, and then that would transform into BAE Systems, B Systems. So this can go under a few different names, but you get the idea. It's a Hawker Hawk. Well, originally, the plane had pretty slow development. It was an internal project. The British military, namely the Air Force, the RAF, had enough trainers in the mid-60s. Of course, we have planes like the Jaguar supposedly coming online, and they thought they were going to go for the F-111K. Well, that never happened, and the Jaguar was delayed. So in 1968, they kind of told, hey, we do need a new advanced jet trainer. So Hawker updated this design, submitted it for trials, and it was selected in 1971. And they would continue to develop it, with the original prototypes flying in 73, 74. Production ramped up in 75, and it was officially put into service in 1976, at which time it began to replace the fallen Gnat, amongst others, including with the red arrows. It's one of the bigger planes we've seen in this set. It is about 40 feet and some change long. Has a pretty respectable wingspan as well, about 35 feet wingspan. It's a little slower than the Gnat, about 630, 640 miles per hour, so about 0.8 Mach. But in a dive, it could exceed Mach 1, getting up to about 1.1, maybe 1.2. Had a pretty good altitude of about 44,000 feet, so again, a little less than the Gnat, but still very good performance. And a lot of this sacrifice was it was designed as a multi-role aircraft. It had some other neat features. For example, the cockpit was kind of modular, held two, of course, but it could be configured to kind of replicate whatever fighter the customer had in its Air Force. And there are other elements of the plane that could be kind of configured or adapted or at least mocked up to represent whatever they were flying. So that was kind of neat. It was configurable. Whoop. And yeah, the T1 is still in service today. Total, it's reported that over 1,000 Hawks have been made, with production still ongoing, at least for later versions. As of 2017, there are still several in military service, I believe 75, 80. And the latest projection for the retirement of the Hawk T.1 isn't until 2030. And who knows if that will be upheld or pushed back even again. It's a very easy to fly plane, very adaptable, very easy to maintain. Just a good all-around jet. And a bit of iconic British history thanks to the Red Arrow's use of it. This model is from Corgi, surprisingly, even though all 8 on the table are British. The only model here is, the only Corgi is this one. It has typical Corgi quality, comes with a very good stand. It has this cradle, which rotates. Probably one of the best stands here. It's got a, very glossy paint scheme like a lot of the Corgi show planes. Some of their military planes are more matte. But this one's more the gloss because of what it is. Gear up or down. Cockpit is closed, but it does have pilots. It's a very metal. The wings and everything. I always like the Corgi British especially. It seems like they put an extra effort in. And they make several paint schemes. But as far as I know, they're all the T1 type. And of course this has been exported to many customers, and they have made armed attack versions, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. But let's first move on to one more propeller driven aircraft. With the Scottish Bulldog proving to be a good trainer and showing that a piston, propeller driven, was not completely out of date, and with the Jet Provost out of production and the cost of maintaining the existing fleet going up, the plane could be a little fickle. It was an early generation jet after all. The British Air Force and Navy decided that they needed a new basic trainer to replace the Provost. And that led to this plane here. The Short brothers, Tucano. Again, T1, pretty typical. Now this is not an indigenous British design. It actually started off in Brazil as the Embraer 312, which in 1984, Short and Embraer formed a partnership. And late that year, Embraer sent an airframe, an early production airframe, to Short for demo purposes and to kind of modify it to meet potential British customers' needs, which was a good idea because in '85, the RAF released official specs for what it wanted in the next trainer. So what Shorts did, They installed a new air brake, and they installed an uprated engine. This is a turboprop, by the way, so that the plane could hit the max speed as needed and also have the stall speed as needed. And that same year, this was selected as the RAF's next basic trainer. And pilots would learn on this, then they would transition over to jet trainers like the Hawk, and then transition to newer jets like the Harrier or Tornado or what have you. They signed a contract with Shorts for 130 Tucanos with an option to buy 15 more. And the first prototype flew in '86. The first production model came off the line on December 30th of that same year. In '87, testing was conducted. The engine was changed a couple more times to improve its climb speed and reliability. And by 1988, the first deliveries were being made to the RAF and the Royal Navy, which would continue at an even pace until 1993 when all 130 were delivered. The option for 15 more was not taken because by 1993 the Cold War was over and there were budget cuts, and frankly the need was just not as great as it once was. Like I said, this is a pretty basic trainer. We're about 32 feet long with a 37-foot wingspan. Our maximum speed's about 315 miles per hour. And it likes to cruise at about 250, 275. And it had a max altitude of around 36,000 feet. Just, off the top of my head. Have a two-person cockpit. Of course, the plane could be flown with a single person. The only real export customers were Kuwait, who bought 16, and Kenya, who bought a dozen of these. So total production at Shorts for their version of the Tucano was 160. It was a good trainer, had an exceptional safety record. Only 5 planes have been lost in RAF service with no pilot fatalities. Maintenance costs, repair costs are actually quite low. In fact, this is 70% cheaper to operate than the Jet Provost, so government always likes that when money gets saved. And still training standards are very high. In fact, this was so liked in the UK that in 2007, as the Iraq War and Afghan wars drug on, some in the government wanted to equip the Tucano T.1 with weapons to make it a light attack ground support plane. But this was quickly shot down. It wasn't really practical. It wasn't designed, at least the British version, for hardports, so it had to be retrofitted, and it was pointed out it just wasn't made for that. It would have been a very inflexible plane. And I think they just didn't want to be seen using a propeller-driven plane on the battlefield. Now, that said, an armed version, at least armed capable, was made for Kuwait. The original idea was basically you could mount gun pods or rockets for target gunnery training, but in a pinch, they can be armed for light attack and patrol. So they can carry about 1,000 pounds under the wings. So not a whole lot, but 2 to 4 bombs or a couple of gun pods. But that's not the British version. This model is again from Aviation 72. pretty, simple, but in a good way. It's pretty much all metal. Okay, the stabilizers are plastic. The tail is metal, wings metal. The propeller spins very nicely. Enclosed cockpit. Landing gear is unfortunately in the extended only position, but that's just kind of what you get with a lot of Aviation 72. It is a tricycle style, as you see. Comes with their basic stand. And this is actually one that Jay helped me pick out. They're not terribly priced. Around $40 if you don't buy them on sale. One final note before we move on. While no RAF pilots or trainees have been lost on this, on June 22nd of 2015, American composer James Horner, who owned one of the Tucanos privately, was killed when his crashed in California. If you don't recognize the name, you will, because he actually wrote a number of very well-known, popular film scores in the 80s and 90s. So, with all respect there, very sad, but don't let that make you think this is a dangerous airplane. It was actually very safe. It was just an unfortunate event. Alrighty, one more and then I'll let you go to probably do something a little more interesting to you. But stay with me for one more. This is the BAE Systems Hawk T.1 Advanced Jet Trainer. This is the current version in use by the RAF and Navy. The T1 is still very much in use. In fact, they still have more of these in inventory. But like I said, they're scheduled to be phased out in about a decade, and more T2s are scheduled to be purchased. This has many modern updates and is built to train for 5th generation aircraft. At the same time, it was more, or is more armed up and more capable as a light fighter. And this dates all the way back to the 1980s in a way. In 1983, Britain, in kind of a cost savings and asset usage move, introduced the T1 A6 variant of the original T1 Hawk, which was basically a Hawk with some systems upgrades and equipped with Sidewinder missiles. It was pretty much an inexpensive interceptor designed to operate for defense, and was fielded for a few years until newer aircraft came online, such as updated versions of the Harrier and Tornado and Jaguar and so on and so forth. With that experience, 85-86, but was at the time British Aerospace, introduced the Hawk 200, which was a single-seat dedicated attack version, equipped with a new radar in the nose, and equipped with missiles as standard, as well as a gun pod as optional. A few of the 200s were purchased. And this would lead directly to the Model 120 LIFT Lift Trainer, which is basically an advanced trainer, especially for gunnery and targeting for South Africa, which would in turn lead to the Model 127 Lift for Australia. And seeing this, a version would be requested in 2004 by the British, which would become the Hawk 128. The prototype first flew in 2005. It was successful, and an initial order for 28 was placed in 2006, with deliveries in 2009. And by 2017, all 28 had been delivered. Also, India was interested. A version was made for them, and they purchased about 120, 125. So basically, yeah, this is just an update, a modernization. We have an improved modern engine. We have kind of the new radar in the nose from the 200. Of course, it's a different model, but gives you the idea. See if I can handle this around. Sometimes I wish I had 3 arms. Hard to pick these things up in a good way. Has more aerials, more antenna. It's capable of air-to-air refueling, which is something the 200 could do as well. In the cockpit, it has 3 new LCD configurable full-color monitors. It has hard points on the wingtips, which can be fitted with air-to-air missiles. It has a new fuel tank arrangement internally. It can also mount external drop tanks. And it can even mount a centerline gun pod. And the training role, this would be for gunnery training. But as you see, it's also ready to go for being used as a light fighter. And if the purchaser did not want to expend even training ordnance, the cockpit is set up for weapons simulation, so it can pretend like it's shooting weapons. Have a slightly new wing profile. Have that kind of cut back and extended nose. Landing gear is a little different position. In fact, the T2 is, of course, very broadly similar to the T1, but in actual parts compatibility, it's only about 10% compatible. So it's a pretty new aircraft and has been pretty successful with production ongoing. As with the previous version, BAE Systems is perfectly happy to customize it to meet the needs of the customer. In Britain, these are used to train pilots on newer aircraft like the FA-18 Hornet and Super Hornet, the Eurofighter Typhoon, and of course the F-35 Lightning, primarily the B model. So this is their most advanced and adaptable trainer to date. And this model is from Falcon. They're about the only ones I know that do essentially second generation Hawks. Typical Falcon stand. This is the British 128 version. They also do a South African and an Australian version. Got the wingtip missiles. The gun pod is removable. The missiles come fixed on, but the gun pod and the fuel tanks can be removed. Landing gear up or down. Comes with 2 canopies, one to display open, one to display closed. The cockpit inside's pretty basic, but it's there. And 1/72 scale figures from Hobbymaster will fit inside, which is always nice. And that pretty much wraps up our British trainers. I think the armed attack version of the Hawk is pretty neat looking, frankly. Well, I appreciate you staying with me. I no, this isn't, you know, front page news type stuff, but there's basically no videos on any of these models out there. And I thought, give them their day in the sun, even if I decided to kind of combine them into one long video. I also have one on the Anson and the Oxford, if you like trainers, and another one on the Provost Proctor, which was a radio trainer from World War II. I decided to do a separate one. But yeah, I found these are a lot of fun, and none of these are the real expensive high-end models, mostly $40, maybe $50 for like the Corgi, but you know, trainers don't get a lot of love, so why not show some here? Any questions or comments, please do post them below. If you could, like, share, subscribe, and check out some of my other videos, maybe. As always, I greatly appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.